Thanks so much, Jim. I really appreciate it. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Heartland Institute. So today, what I'll do is I'll speak about three things, or we'll do three things. So one, I'll talk a little bit at the beginning about why I decided to write this book, sort of the interview process, and so forth. Then secondly, I have a presentation on Richard M. Daley, Rich Daley, that talks a little bit about his life story, and then about some of his accomplishments and mistakes as mayor. And one thing I'll say here, and I'll mention it again later, is in the book and then in my talk today, I try to be very balanced about his accomplishments on the one hand and his mistakes on the other hand, and sort of tell the whole story and then let readers decide, for themselves whether they think he was a good mayor or a bad mayor. I don't try and influence people in that decision. So, and then thirdly, I'll open it up to questions and comments that you might have, and hopefully you have some good questions. So, in terms of the book process, I started the book about 3.5 years ago. I actually first thought about writing this book about almost 15 years ago. I was studying public policy, and I was studying politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I was from Chicago, and I thought, I'll just buy a book on Daley. I'm sure someone's written one. And it just would be an interesting thing for me to read. And I was really surprised at that time that no one had written a book. And so I thought about doing it myself, and I ended up not doing it. And I sort of got distracted by other things in my life. And 10 years passed, and so about 3.5 or 4 years ago, I sort of went through the same thing. I said, well, I'm sure someone's written a book on Daley. I'll buy it. I'll read it. And I was just really surprised that no one had written a book on him. At that point, he'd been in public office for four decades. And so I thought it would be sort of personally important to me to write a book like this. I also thought it'd be important for the city of Chicago, and so I decided to write the book. So I started working this. He announced his retirement in September of 2010. I started working on the book about a year before then. So he was still mayor of Chicago. Obviously, he was well known in Chicago. He was a powerful person, obviously. So at first it was difficult to get interviews, as you might imagine. So I really did two things. One is I networked with friends, acquaintances, old high school buddies, and people like that. And a number of those people did get me interviews just as a favor to me. So they knew a person who was either personal friends with Daley or a professional associate of Daley, and they just said, you should talk to Keith as a favor to me. Which interestingly is a very Chicago thing to do. I mean, in business and politics, this is a very common thing to do in Chicago. So I was able to get about 20 or so interviews that way. And then the second thing I did is I cold called a lot of people. In my prior career, I'd been in business for a long time, so I sort of had a thick skin about it. And I sometimes called people 20 or 30 or even 40 times. I don't know if you've ever received a message from someone 40 times without returning their phone call, but it's interesting. It's a little bit obviously uncomfortable for the person leaving the message. But after a while, it actually sort of becomes a little bit uncomfortable for the person who's not returning the phone call. And I found a lot of the people I wanted to interview were pretty hard-working and pretty successful in their own right. And a lot of successful people work long hours. So one of the most effective things I did is I would call people at like 7 o'clock in the morning or 7 o'clock in the evening, and they would frequently pick up their own phone. And they'd be like, yes, Keith, I've gotten your messages. But once you had them on the phone, it was much more difficult for them to say no. It's much easier to tell a secretary or assistant or something to tell this guy no. But when they were on the phone, they would frequently say yes, and they would say, I'll talk to you today, or I'll talk to you tomorrow. So I actually got a lot of interviews just through persistence. Most of my interviews were pretty long. Most of them were 2 to 4 hours. A lot of them were 3 hours. And I did that on purpose. I have a little bit of a cynical view of human nature, and so my operative theory was like you can sort of lie to me for about an hour, and then you can end the interview, which you're completely entitled to do, or you could start telling the truth. And so almost the most interesting things people shared with me were always towards the end of the interview when they'd been talking with me for 2.5 or 3 hours. And what I found is people, they make judgments about you when they're talking to you. Are you intelligent? Are you trustworthy? Are you honest? Is this a person I can share things with? And there you can see them sort of deciding that as they're talking to you, and it frequently takes a while for people to decide, this is someone I'm going to be honest to. Which I was fine with. By the way, when people were lying to me, a lot of times it was a lot of fun. It was good for them. It was good for me. I didn't mind it at all. So that was a part of the interview process. I interviewed a lot of people. I interviewed like about 140 people. Many of those were on the record. Many of them were off the record. Some of them were a mixture of on and off the record. And I was, whatever people were comfortable doing, I was comfortable doing. So that's a little bit about the interview process. This is the first biography of Daley, which is surprising. He's been in public office since 1970. So now I'll do my presentation, and just, again, keep in mind, I try to be very balanced about his life and about his accomplishments and mistakes, and so we'll approach it from that perspective. Okay, so I'm sure many of you know, hey, actually, raise your hands if you either grew up in Chicago or have lived in Chicago a long time. Okay, so most of the people, and then other people who are grew up somewhere else or are from other places. Okay, so sort of a mix. So the Daleys are from a neighborhood in Chicago called Bridgeport. It's on the south side of the city. It's near Kaminsky Park. When the first mayor Daley grew up there, and then when his son grew up there, I think it's fair to say that Bridgeport was sort of a blue-collar ethnic neighborhood. It was known as being an Irish neighborhood. That's not exactly accurate. There was sort of Irish people, Lithuanian people, German people, Polish people. There was a mix of people. Almost all of them were Catholic, so it was a very sort of blue-collar Catholic neighborhood. And the Daleys lived in the Irish Catholic section of Bridgeport. All right, so we have a few pop quizzes today. Here's the first one. What was one of Rich Daley's favorite activities in high school? So we have student government, the debate club, the chess club, or playing basketball.
Debate.
So it's actually playing basketball. He was a very average kid. He loved to play basketball with his buddies. He wasn't a particularly good student. He wasn't president of his class. He was just a very sort of average kid from Bridgeport who liked to sort of hang out with his buddies. He loved the White Sox baseball team, and so in 1968, the Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago. At this time, his father, Dick Daley, was mayor of Chicago. He'd been mayor of Chicago since 1955, so he was a mayor for 13 years. The first mayor, Dick Daley, was a very talented politician, and I think that's true whether you agree with his politics or disagree with his politics. He was talented. He was also very, very controversial. Some people really liked him, and some people really disliked him. Rich Daley, who's pictured here, this is in 1968. Rich Daley had just graduated from DePaul Law School. He was 26 years old. He was sitting in the first row at the Democratic National Convention, which is, I guess, you get to do if your father's mayor. The 1968 convention was sort of a pivotal time in American cultural history. The 50s in the United States were very culturally cohesive. A lot of people had the same beliefs and sort of the societal views. That changed a lot in the 60s and the 70s. There was a whole younger generation of people, some of whom were high school students, some of whom were college students, who were very upset about things like the Vietnam War. There were race riots all over America. There was 100 race riots in the mid-60s. And so there was a younger generation of people who were upset with sort of an older generation of people. A lot of, for some of these kids, Mayor Daley represented the older generation of people, so he was very unpopular. What you see here is a picture of Rich Daley. By all accounts, he's yelling at the speaker, who's a senator from Connecticut by the name of Ribicoff. By many accounts, he's also swearing at the speaker. I think the '68 convention is sort of an interesting time for Rich Daley. On the one hand, he was sort of protective of his father. His father was getting a lot of grief from these protesters, and I think sort of his natural inclination was to sort of defend and protect his father. On the other hand, he was much closer in age to the protesters. He was 26 years old here. Many of the protesters were sort of 20 or 21 or 22. So in 1974, on the left is the first Mayor Daley, Dick Daley. On the right, his son, Rich Daley. One of the things that's interesting about this photo is the Daleys look sort of unusually happy and relaxed in this photo. It's hard to find a photo where they both look happy and relaxed. This is one of them that I could find. At this time, the first mayor Daley was a very powerful public figure, very powerful politician. He was opening a lot of doors for his son Rich. His son Rich was an Illinois state senator in Springfield who would get elected by overwhelming margins because of his father. And so his father was actually very helpful to him at this stage of his career. Another pop quiz. What nickname did his colleagues in the Illinois Senate give Rich Daley in the 1970s? So we have A, the Prince of Bridgeport, B, Daddy's Boy, C, Rich the Snitch, and D, Dirty Little Richie. Anyone?
Dirty Little Richie.
So the correct answer is D, Dirty Little Richie. So one of his Illinois Senate colleagues by the name of Dawn Clark Netsch, she was a Democrat from Chicago. Rich Daley's a Democrat from Chicago. You'd think they'd have a lot of things in common. Actually, they didn't. Dawn Clark Netsch used to propose a lot of different bills in the Illinois Senate, and she's a liberal, sort of progressive Democrat. So she'd proposed a lot of like consumer protection bills and things like that. And frequently they would get killed by her own party, the Democratic machine, which she found very frustrating. And so one time she was being interviewed by reporters after some of her bills were killed. She was very frustrated, and she talked about the dirty tricks that the Democratic machine was playing. She also talked about how Little Richie was killing her bills. That's what people used to call him back then, Little Richie. And the reporter wrote a story where he combined dirty tricks with Little Richie and gave him the nickname Dirty Little Richie, which stuck for a long time. This nickname stuck for at least a decade. So in 1980, this is the most important race in Rich Daley's career. In 1980, he ran for Cook County State's Attorney. His father had died in 1976, so his father was no longer around to help him professionally in his career. And the Democratic machine, surprisingly, lined up completely against Rich Daley. They tried to end his career in 1980. So the Democratic mayor of Chicago was Jane Byrne. She was the first female mayor of Chicago. The chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party was a gentleman by the name of Fast Eddie Vdolyak, so he was the boss of the party. And there was a well-known alderman by the name of Ed Burke. The three of them sort of ganged up and backed Ed Burke for Cook County State's Attorney, specifically to beat Daley. Ed Burke actually didn't want to run. The three of them decided he had to beat Rich Daley. And 48 of the 50 ward aldermen, Democratic ward aldermen, backed Ed Burke. Only 2 backed Rich Daley. Pretty surprising. He sort of son of the boss. You would think that the ward aldermen, almost every single one of whom had been appointed by the first Mayor Daley, would back the Daley, but they did not. They backed Burke. This was very tough on Daley. He knew actually each one of these people personally, and he'd known them his whole life, and they all backed the other guys. Really rough on him. He built his own political organization because the Democratic machine was not supporting him. He built it from scratch, and he beat Ed Burke pretty convincingly. And then in the general election, of course, most of the people in the room remember 1980 was the year of the Reagan Revolution. In general, in 1980, Republicans won almost everything. Nationally, they won. In the state, they won. In the county, they won. Rich Daley was actually one of the very few Democrats to win in 1980. So this is the most important race of his career. He won without the help of the Democratic machine. He won without the help of his father. And he did it sort of as a late bloomer. In 1980, he was 38 years old, which I guess it depends on your perspective. But from my perspective, is sort of late to have your first sort of real accomplishment. So this is a really big moment in his career. 3 years later, there was a very sort of nasty campaign for mayor in Chicago. Jane Byrne, who's sitting on the left, was the sitting mayor of Chicago. Harold Washington, who's in the middle, was a pretty talented black politician. He was funny, he was charismatic, he was a good speaker, he was a very good politician. Rich Daley's on his right. Both Jane Byrne and Rich Daley vastly underestimated Harold Washington. Jane Byrne thought Rich Daley was the competition. Rich Daley thought Jane Byrne was the competition. And actually, Harold Washington was the best of the bunch. And Daley came in third. It was a pretty devastating loss for him personally. And politically, it was a hard loss for him. And historically, the Daley base, the Daley family base, were white ethnic voters. In 1983, white ethnic voters were extremely upset with Rich Daley. They perceived him as coming into the late race, running against an incumbent Democratic mayor and splitting the white vote. And so the Daley base actually got very upset with Rich Daley in 1983. Then something went on called the Council Wars. Here's a photograph I've labeled the two Eddies. The gentleman with his finger pointing is Fast Eddie Vdolyak. He's pointing his finger at Mayor Harold Washington. The gentleman behind him to the left is Ed Burke, who at that point in his career was known as the other Eddie. And the two Eddies caused a lot of problems in the 1980s. Chicago had a really bad reputation, both locally and nationally. Chicago was known for the Council Wars. It was known as Beirut by the Lake. And the city was really racially divisive in the 80s. And we also had this problem called the Rust Belt. The whole Midwest was deindustrializing. Jobs were leaving the Midwest. Jobs were leaving Chicago. So the 80s were, in some ways, a low point for Chicago. All right, next pop quiz. So who were key Daley advisors in the 1989 mayoral race? We have David Axelrod, Rahm Emanuel, David Wilhelm, Bill Daley. We have none of the above.
All the above.
We have all of the above. And that's right, all of the above is correct. So Bill Daley advised his brother Rich in 80 and 83 and also in 89 and 91. He's always a very important advisor. But in 89, he had sort of three new advisors, David Axelrod, Rahm Emanuel, and David Wilhelm. They were quite different than his other advisors. They were a lot younger. Back then, they were in their late 20s and early 30s. They were much more liberal than his traditional advisors, and they were super talented. And Daley ran a very different campaign in 1989 than he ran in 83. He had just lost really badly, you got to remember, 6 years earlier, so that's not a long time. And in 1989, he ran a different campaign. He campaigned, he said, I'm going to be mayor of all the people. I'm going to be mayor of all the people. He literally said that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And in 89, he got the lakefront liberal vote, which is sort of surprising. It's not what you'd expect from a Daley. He got an overwhelming support in the gay community. Very surprising, not what you'd expect from a Daley. He got a decent chunk of the Hispanic vote and sort of put together a coalition and won a pretty convincing victory in 1989. So I'm not going to go through this today. I'll just point out I wrote an article on Illinois Issues, which is a respected public policy magazine, on Daley's legacy, where I sort of go through his accomplishments and his mistakes. And so I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I'm going to go through some of them today. So Daley, Jim mentioned when he introduced me that Rich Daley is the longest-serving mayor in the history of Chicago. He's mayor for 22 years. I think when you talk about his accomplishments and his mistakes, and I think this is true of anyone, it's not personal to Daley, I think you have to keep in context that being mayor is a really difficult job. It's really difficult. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and there's very few jobs that I can think of that are harder. I think being president of the United States is harder. But other than that, there's very few jobs that I think is more difficult than being mayor. And one of the reasons for that is that people have such high expectations for their mayor. If you have a pothole on your street, you don't get mad. You don't get mad at the president of the United States. You don't get mad at the governor of Illinois. But if your pothole stays on your street long enough, pretty soon you're going to be like, well, the goddamn mayor should have fixed my pothole. Like, what's going on? And so I think people have very high expectations for mayor. And the other comment I'd make is, for me, in some ways, a metaphor is like a Rubik's Cube. So a Rubik's Cube is a square. It's six-sided. It has different colors like yellow, orange, green, blue. Well, if you think about a Rubik's Cube, almost anyone can solve one side of a Rubik's Cube. It's actually quite easy to do. Solving two sides of a Rubik's Cube is actually significantly harder than solving one side. And solving six sides of the Rubik's Cube is actually very difficult, and almost no one can do it. Almost no one can solve six sides of a Rubik's Cube. And in some ways, being mayor is like coming into the office and someone putting a big Rubik's Cube on your desk every day. So, you have to improve the schools, you have to improve housing, you have to bring jobs to the city, you have to balance the budget, you have to get minorities involved in government, and you have to do it in a way without pissing off different groups of people. It's very challenging to do. So anyway, we can keep that in mind. We'll talk about some of his accomplishments and some of his mistakes. So One of his accomplishments is really strengthening race relations in Chicago. We talked about in the 1980s, Chicago had a really poor reputation as having some of the worst relationships, race relationships in the country, the council wars and all that stuff. By the time Daley retired as mayor, that was no longer true. If you were African American in Chicago, some of the most successful African American business people, politicians, entertainers are from Chicago, and this whole sort of messy racial thing had largely disappeared. A second big accomplishment is I think Daley took really big risks to improve public schools and improve public housing. And I focus on the risk taking. I think one of the important things leaders should do is whether they're leading an organization or a company or a community, is to try and get people to focus on what's important. Everyone's busy, but sometimes people just focus on unimportant things. I think we would all agree that public schools and public housing are really important. In '95, Daley was the first big city mayor in the country to take personal responsibility for public schools. All his political advisors told him not to do it. They told him it was very politically risky, and he did it anyway. A few years later, he did something called the Plan for Transformation, where he tried to improve public housing in the country. And I think these are really important things, and as a leader, that's what you want to do. And by the way, and we can talk about this later in Q&A, is I think reasonable people could have differences of opinion on whether the bet on public schools worked out and on the bet on public housing worked out. And I think people could have different opinions about that. But I actually don't think that diminishes his active leadership, which is to focus on these things. Another accomplishment is providing 2 decades of stability to the political and business communities. And at first blush, this might not seem like a lot, but it's actually really important. So if you think back between 1976 and 1989, Chicago was chaos. We had 5 mayors in 13 years. We had 5 superintendents of Chicago public schools in 13 years. We had the council wars. And in a chaotic environment, business people and politicians don't take risks to invest in the future. You don't start businesses, you don't hire people, you don't do big projects, you don't build schools, because if it's chaos, you're just too afraid. But in a stable environment, business people and political people are willing to take risks. So Daley, whether you like him or you don't like him, definitely provided 2 decades of stability in Chicago. And there's a lot of people, not people he controlled, just people, business people and politicians who actually took some risks because there was a stable environment. So this is what I think is Daley's most important accomplishment, and then we'll talk about some of his mistakes. So I think Daley's most important accomplishment is his role in the transformation of Chicago from a Rust Belt city into a global city. So we talked about how in the 80s the Rust Belt was going on. The whole Midwest was deindustrializing, jobs were leaving. And Chicago was talked about in the same breath of Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, Chicago. That's what people talk about, Detroit, St. Louis, Cleveland, and Chicago. Here's a photograph of the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Monroe Street 5 years before Rich Daley was born. It's actually an attractive photo, but it's sort of quaint. It looks like a, sort of a quaint, nice little Midwestern town. Here's exactly the same intersection. This is exactly the same intersection in 2010. You of course can see Millennium Park. You can see part of the skyline in the background. In 2010, Chicago was named 6th on the Global Cities Index, following cities such as New York, London, Tokyo, Paris, and Hong Kong. So very different group of cities than Cleveland, Detroit, and so forth. In order to be a global city, what people demand of a global city is you have to have a really powerful economy, and you have to have a really vibrant culture in the arts. So basically, people move to global cities first to get a good job. They want a good job. And then when they're not working, they want to do something fun. They want to have some culture and some arts and so forth. And Daley was both a pro-business mayor and a pro-culture mayor, which might sound easy to do, but it's actually a lot harder than it sounds to be both pro-business and pro-culture. Okay, so we talked about our Rubik's Cube at the beginning. He's mayor for 22 years. The likelihood that someone would be mayor of a big city for 22 years and not make some significant mistakes is very low, and Daley did make some mistakes. So one mistake is a decade-long large structural budget deficit. I wish I was better at Excel and this would be upside down in red, but these are all budget deficits. So Daley became mayor in '89. Between '89 and 2000, he actually balanced every budget, which is hard to do. It takes a lot of discipline to balance a budget. Starting in 2001, he ran his first operating deficit. It's more than $100 million. And then every single year, including one that's not on this chart, 2011, he ran really large operating deficits. Some of Daley's supporters say, "Oh, you're being too hard on him. Lehman Brothers crashed, and we had a fiscal crisis." Well, Lehman Brothers crashed here. So all of these operating deficits were actually sort of in good times and good economies. And so this, I would say, is a significant mistake that he left for Chicagoans today and for his successor, the current mayor of Chicago. And this is a related thing. Another mistake is, these are the parking meters here. But the mistake, I think, the flawed parking meter was really a symptom of the pension crisis and the large structural budget deficit. So, it's the pension crisis has got very large. The structural budget deficit got very large, and I think in some ways Daley and his advisors were looking for a quick fix. And whoa, I can sell the parking meters for $1.1 billion. That sounds like a lot of money. Maybe we should do that. But it didn't really address the underlying problem, and the underlying problem was the structural budget deficit and the pension crisis. So of course, whenever you go for a quick fix, it rarely works. And the pension, I'm sorry, the parking meter deal didn't work and has been very unpopular. Similarly, another mistake is a failure to take on entrenched unions, and this omission, something that Daley did not do, he didn't take on the unions, was a contributing factor in both the pension crisis and the fiscal budget deficit. And it's also something that his successor, the current mayor, is left to deal with. And there's no way that the city of Chicago can fix its pension problem or fix its budget deficit problem unless it takes on the unions. The percentage of the city's budget that goes to unions and employees and so forth is like 2/3. It's like 67%. So unless you can address this issue, the other issues will not be fixed. So another big mistake is the midnight destruction of Meigs Field. I think most people are familiar with this. Daley ordered Meigs Field to be ripped up in the middle of the night, and he continues to defend it. From my perspective, it's a huge leadership mistake. It's a complete violation of democratic norms. And one thing I'd say is, America, the United States of America, is the greatest democracy in the history of human civilization, which is amazing. The reason we're the greatest democracy in the history of human civilization is because we have the rule of law and not of men. So that's my opinion. I'll say something jokingly, but I think it's true. So when I was in high school, I was sort of a naughty kid, and I used to, stay out late and sort of sneak in the house in the middle of the night. And my mom would come downstairs and she would yell at me, and she'd say, "What are you doing sneaking around? Nothing good ever happens after midnight." And that was true of me in high school, and that's true of Daley's decision with regard to Meigs Field. So another mistake is a tolerance for political corruption. This is the city's former head of intergovernmental affairs after his conviction in July of 2006 for hiring fraud at City Hall. Hiring fraud is a bad thing. Another mistake that occurred on Daley's watch is something called the hired truck scandal, where 48 people went to jail. It's a bad thing when 48 people who work for you go to jail. So another mistake is Daley supported inept political candidates for important offices. Here's a picture of Rod Blagojevich on the right and Todd Stroger. I'm sorry, Rod Blagojevich on the left and Todd Stroger on the right. What's really surprising about this is over the course of his career, Daley, by and large, had a policy of just not supporting anyone. And so what he would say publicly, which I personally agree with, is, I'm a leader of the city. My job is to be the leader of the city. Voters should pick their own candidates. So I'm just not going to spend my time endorsing candidates, which, I think is a good policy. Well, he made a couple exceptions to that. And Rod Blagojevich, he supported wholeheartedly. And Todd Stroger supported wholeheartedly. So my view is, if you don't endorse anyone, then you can say, well, I'm not getting involved. But if you do endorse someone, they either turn out to be good leaders or bad leaders. And so The final mistake I'll mention is allowing a high level of crime to persist, particularly towards the end of his term as mayor. I'm actually very empathetic. I think crime is actually very difficult to solve, and there's a lot of things that beyond the mayor's control. There's a lot of socioeconomic issues. There's like broken families. There's gangs. There's drugs. There's all these really hard issues, but despite that, it's really important, and so I think Daley could have done more on this issue, particularly at the end of his term. A couple more slides, and then we'll go to Q&A. So, despite his mistakes, Rich Daley was a powerful and influential person, both here in Chicago and nationally. Here's a photograph of Rich Daley and Barack Obama having lunch at Meigs Coffee Shop. Obama actually moved to Chicago in the mid-1980s. He was very inspired by Harold Washington's electoral victory as mayor. Harold Washington was the first black politician to become a mayor of a large urban city. Obama at that time was working on Wall Street in a job he hated, and he was very inspired by Harold Washington, so he moved to Chicago. And his goal, his big dream, was to become mayor of Chicago. So obviously he failed at that. And what's interesting also about this photo is these two men were not close. So historically, Obama sort of kept Daley at arm's length. He was a little bit leery of being sort of associated with the Democratic machine. Daley also kept Obama a little bit at arm's length. Historically, he was worried about sort of an attractive, well-spoken black man running against him for mayor of Chicago. So historically they were not close, but what ambitious men do when it would be helpful to their career, they have lunch. Barack Obama had just won the Democratic nomination to be a United States Senator. So Daley and Obama had lunch. Obama endorsed Daley. Daley endorsed Obama, and they went on with their careers. So here's a photo called Chicago Boys in the White House. Barack Obama is President of the United States. On the left is Rahm Emanuel, who's Chief of Staff. In the middle, standing up, is David Axelrod, who's Senior Advisor to the President. All three of these men had spent really formative parts of their career in Chicago, sort of under the Daley umbrella in different ways. All right, so last pop quiz here. So who did Daley describe as the most focused and effective person he had ever worked with in public life? So first choice, his father, the first Mayor Daley. Second choice, Harold Washington. Third choice, George Washington, who's pictured here. Fourth choice, his brother, Bill Daley. And last choice is Rahm Emanuel. So his father's not correct. Who said Rahm? There he is, Rahm. Rahm Emanuel is correct. So in 2003, Rahm Emanuel ran for Congress, and Daley, who typically did not endorse people, was very unusual. He endorsed Rahm Emanuel. He made a TV commercial for Rahm Emanuel, and he publicly said, Rahm Emanuel is the most focused and effective person I've ever come across in my public life, which for Daley is like a major policy speech. And here's two photographs. On the left is Rahm Emanuel in 1989. You can see the Daley sort of posters behind him. I think he was 29 or 30 years old. His job in the campaign was a fundraiser. He was a very effective fundraiser. He raised $7 million for Daley in 6 weeks. This is, just to keep in mind, this is pre-internet. This is pre-cell phone. He has like a rotary phone on his desk, and he raised $7 million in 6 weeks. It's hard to do. I don't know if you ever called people up and asked them for money, but it is not an easy thing to do. On the right is a photograph. Daley is still mayor. He had announced his retirement, but he was still mayor. Rahm Emanuel had actually run for mayor and won, so he was mayor-elect. And he and Daley are at a White Sox game. And I'll stop there and open it up for questions and comments.
The question, I have two things about Daley. One, I guess you would have to agree that all politicians do things that are in their political interest. And to that, I would like you to talk about or answer, why did Daley feel it was in his political interest to go to an open primary, after his first term?
Yeah, so I don't know if everyone's familiar with this. In case they aren't, I'll just mention it. So Daley became mayor in 1989. He's mayor for 2 years, which was sort of a stub term, and then he ran for re-election in 91. The law was changed. In the past, there was primaries, a Democratic primary and then a Republican primary, and then those two candidates would run for mayor. The rules were changed around 91, I forgot the exact date, to have an open primary. So sort of anyone could run. You don't have to say if you're a Democrat or Republican or independent. Sort of anyone could run. Someone proposed it. Daley supported it. He said, I think this is a good idea. My take on it, it goes back, sort of everyone always fights the last war, right? And so, for Daley, the war that he lost was in '83. He lost to Harold Washington. It was very tough on him personally. And so his fear was always that an attractive African-American candidate would run, like Harold Washington or Barack Obama or whoever. And that if that person's a Democrat, which they probably would be, then he would have to go head-to-head with a sort of attractive African-American candidate. So in an open sort of primary, there might be 3 candidates or 4 candidates or whatever. He thought maybe the odds would be better. That would be my take on it. He never publicly said that. That would be my take on it.
That was my conclusion after many years, because I could never understand or never understood why. And then it dawned on me that when you alluded to that just then, I had thought about that and said that was the very reason, because then he would not have to worry, he would not need 60, 70, 80% of the African-American vote. If he got 10, 20% and he got the rest of the ethnic vote, he was reasonably certain to win. I asked that question of David Axelrod. He ducked it, and he said Daley thought it was the fair thing to do because he wanted to be the mayor for all the people. And I thought that was nonsense.
Well, it's not mutually exclusive.
No,
by the way,
not mutually exclusive, but
you could think it's fair and it's better for me. Yeah, it could be.
Reality. That is what happened.
And by the way, if you look back at the numbers, so in Daley, when he won for mayor in '89, he only got 8% of the black vote, so it's pretty low. So this law, which passed maybe 2 years later, it seems like it's reasonable to think, well, I only got 8% of the black vote in the last election. Maybe I should do this. But if you fast forward the movie to the future, by 2003, Daley got 63% of the black vote. So it's a pretty amazing change. Well, again, that's not his fault. No, that's not his fault. But I mean, but going from 8% to 63% of the vote is a big change.
The other question, too, real quickly is, hypothetically, had Harold Washington lived to be mayor for another 10, 15 years, what would you hypothesize Daley's political career would have been?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, in politics, there's a certain element of luck in the sense that it's really hard to beat an incumbent, just in general, particularly a popular incumbent. So if you want to run for something, a lot of times people wait. They wait, well, will this guy retire? Will this guy die or whatever? And so it's, if Harold was stayed in office for 20 years or 15 or whatever, that's a long wait. So it's hard to say. He was state's attorney. He was a popular state's attorney. So I don't know. I think he probably would have run for something else. Who knows what that would have been.
Daley was a politician for a long time.
Yeah. Almost his whole adult
career.
life. Yeah.
And then he retired as a multi-millionaire, shades of Sid Yates, for all the money.
So I don't know if that's true, what his personal wealth is.
Very nice condominium.
Oh, but not a multi-million-dollar condominium. It was, I mean, what does the mayor of Chicago make? I don't know, maybe $200,000 a year. I think he can afford the condominium he lived in based on his mayoral. So, unless you know something I don't know. Yeah.
What about voter fraud? It's pretty well accepted that Senior Daley, I mean, it was just part of the culture.
Yeah.
And he got Kennedy elected.
Yeah.
How prevalent was it during Dirty Richie's terms?
So I don't have any sort of inside scoop on that. My sense is that it was significantly lower than when his father was mayor. I'm sure in different wards and in different areas of the city today it continues. I don't think it is as important this is a joke, but it's true. So Anton Cermak, who's people credit with sort of being the first person to create a machine in Chicago, used to say, only bad ward captains need to steal votes, which is really sort of funny when you think about it. And his point being is if you're really good, you actually know your voters and you know your constituents in your area, and you can get them to support who you want without stealing votes. I think politics changed a lot in American society in the 90s and the first decade of the 21st century, and I would say that's true in Chicago. So the old game was sort of a patronage game where you gave out jobs or bribes or whatever, and you got people to vote for the candidate you want. Sort of the modern game of politics is differing. It's three M's. It's money, media, and message. So the new game is you raise a lot of money. You then buy media, which is TV and internet and things like that, and then you get your message across. So like in 1989, for example, Daley raised a lot of money. He got a lot of media, and his message was, I'm going to be a mayor for all the people. I'm going to be mayor for all the people. I'm going to be mayor for all the people. I'm going to be mayor for all the people. And he said that hundreds of times. And voters, I think, voted for him. And so I think he became very skilled at the modern game of politics, which is money, media, and message. And then I think voters, by the way, just in general, with mayors of Chicago, but also with presidents and anything, I think voters get the politicians they deserve. I literally believe that for every office in every city, in everything in the country. And so I think voters knew what Daley's strengths were and his weaknesses were. I really do believe that. And I think they kept re-electing him. And so my view is if you were unhappy with his terms, I think you should be mad at the voters. One quick comment, because someone here, I can't remember who we talked about this. One thing I didn't talk about in terms of his life story, in my opinion, so Daley was mayor for 22 years. In my opinion, he was a very good mayor, a really excellent mayor between 1989 and 2003. So he had a 14-year run where I believe he really accomplished a lot. And then, in my opinion, he really made a lot of mistakes between his last two terms, between 2003 and 2011. And we could talk about all sorts of reasons why, but for me personally, I think there's like a leadership lesson there, which is I think if people stay in power too long, and not just politicians, it could be a principal of a school or a businessman who's a CEO of a company, or it could be a mayor. I think frequently they actually achieve a lot at the beginning because they're really excited and they're energized and they want to prove to people, that they're talented. And then once they become in that position for like a really long time, then they sort of say, like, I'm the guy, and people. And then I think they frequently make mistakes. So I do think there's a leadership lesson there.
You said that, obviously very big city mayor, tackling crime is a big challenge.
Yeah.
I was born in New York City. My family moved out in the late 70s, and New York City was hell.
Right.
Back then. And you go now, Rudy Giuliani was elected mayor, beat David Dinkins, who didn't seem to want to do anything about that. It can be done. Hard decisions are made. Rudy took a lot of hell for a lot of years, and then suddenly, Oz appears, and New York is completely transformed. Why couldn't Richard Daley, as effective as he's been on so many other things, make that happen for Chicago? Was he unwilling to make some difficult choices? What was the, demotivation for him tackling crime?
Yeah, so there's a lot to that question. So I think he, when he was in office towards the beginning, like in the 90s, like in the mid-90s, he really was putting a lot of time and effort trying to improve crime. Towards the end of his term, so he retired in 2011, like I was talking about his last two terms where it lacked some of the accomplishment. So I'm not an expert on crime, but I do think that sort of your thesis, if I understand it correctly, that there's a lot of truth to it. I think if you want to be mayor, you want to be a leader who reduces crime, it's tough. The police force is large. If I remember correctly, there's about 12,000 active police officers. There's a lot of retired police officers, and they're very politically active. So changing the rules and changing people's responsibilities and so forth with a very politically active group is a challenge. So there's a lot of sort of management issues, and there's budgetary issues, and there's just voter issues about making the tough decisions. that I think he tried to do some of those in the 90s, but then in his last 2 terms, I could not find evidence where he was really doing those tough decisions in a way that would, dramatically lower crime. So if I understand your thesis correct, I sort of agree with it.
We can debate whether it's appropriate for a mayor to take over a school system from the school board. I mean, that's obvious was a mayor debate when it happened. But my question is, I don't think he was very effective in kind of addressing the school issue at all. We're still seeing the same issue today. Your question is, you said it was one of his strengths, one of his positives.
Yeah.
Why do you think that him taking over schools was a good step?
Well, I think you got to separate the Leadership Act from the Management Act, right? So I think really it was an important Leadership Act to take personal responsibilities for schools. Historically in big cities, not just Chicago, but other big cities, the way it worked politically was no mayors took responsibility for the schools. So they would say there's an independent school board. So the schools are all screwed up, and I'm totally sympathetic to that, but it's not my problem. That's historically was how all the politicians handle it. So when Daley, when school reform happened in '95, Daley got to appoint the board, and then the board got to appoint the CEO. And then he said personally, that's my board and that's my CEO. So he took personal responsibility. It then became, if people were unhappy with the schools, he couldn't say, oh, that's not my problem. If people say, I'm unhappy with the schools, then they could say, well, I'm unhappy with the mayor. So politically, it was taking responsibility. I personally think that's a good thing. I think sort of the independent school boards representing the community were all messed up and were highly ineffective, in my opinion. So I think him taking responsibility was a good thing. Then it becomes like it's on his lap. He's the CEO, he's the manager, whatever. The schools are really tough in Chicago. So Chicago's schools, 85% of the kids live below the poverty line. 85% of the kids are minorities. A lot of the kids come from single-parent families, and there's crime and there's drugs and stuff. So a lot of those issues are sort of beyond the control of a mayor. I mean, some kids come to school with like no shoes on or like a ripped shirt. They haven't eaten breakfast. They have no lunch. So you're a teacher, you're talking to a kid who has like no shoes on, hasn't eaten breakfast, hasn't eaten lunch. Well, just as a teacher who's actually physically present in the room, how am I going to reach that kid? And maybe he's not paying attention, whatever. That's really hard. Well, the mayor's like 2 or 3 or 4 steps removed from that teacher in the room. So I'm very sympathetic. Like if someone said to me, hey, Keith, tomorrow when you wake up, you fix the schools. So I wake up, I take my shower, I eat breakfast, I get out my pad of paper, and what do? And even if I come up with really good ideas, are they politically feasible? So let me tell you a quick story. I didn't put it in the book, but a quick story. I forgot the year, but when Daley had been mayor for a long time, some businessmen came to him. They're wealthy businessmen, and they said, like, we have like 20 people, and we're each going to give $1 million. So we'll give $20 million. And this is like our hard-earned money. This is like our own money. We want to improve the schools. And so we have a plan. So our plan is we have some grade schools that are functioning pretty well, where the kids are getting a pretty good education and they're graduating 8th grade pretty good. But then if you look at a map, there's no good high schools. So here's what we should do. We should take some of our money and we should find these good grade schools that don't have a good high school and put a high school like 3 blocks away. So that the idea would the kids would graduate from 8th grade with a pretty good education. Then they'd go to this new high school where there's good teachers and everything, and they'd get a good high school education. So Daley's like, oh, this is a great idea. Let me just look into the politics, and I'll be back to you. So Daley goes and talks to all the aldermen and the city council and everything, goes and talks to the CPS and the Board of Education, and they all hate it. They hate it. I mean, so there's 20 guys offering to give $20 million, and everyone hates it. Well, the city council hated it because they said, oh, well, there's 50 of us in the city council, $20 million bucks. Just give each of us 2% of the money, and we'll do whatever we want with it. CPS, sort of the same thing. They said, oh, $20 million bucks, just give it to us, and we'll do our own programs. So Daley went back to the businessmen and said, well, here's, I'm sort of reporting back. And the businessmen said, we're not giving the money to the aldermen. We're not giving the money to the CPS. And so what happened? Nothing. So you literally had 20 people who were willing to donate $20 million bucks, and nothing happened. And so And I actually think it's a pretty good idea. If you build a good high school near what was a well-functioning grade school, like it seems like a pretty good idea to me. But nothing happened because of the politics. So, I sort of hear you when you say, well, has school reform worked and has schools improved or what? But I think it's really tough. I mean, if you think of it in the sense of if you had to wake up tomorrow and it was like your job to fix the schools, and you had to deal with the aldermen, you had to deal with CPS, you had to deal with like 85% of the kids living below the poverty level. It's tough. It's a tricky problem.
What would you say are some of like the big differences in the style of governing and managing with Mayor Emmanuel compared to Mayor Daley?
Well, it's a good question. It's a tough question. I mean, Emmanuel's only been mayor for 2 years. Daley was mayor for 22 years. So it's easier to talk about Daley because you sort of know the whole, you've seen the whole movie. Yeah, Emmanuel, you haven't seen the whole movie. I actually think you're a little bit younger. I actually think there's a lot of parallels between Daley and Emmanuel the first couple of years. All these politicians, not all of them, but many of them, I think, come in their first couple of years in office with really great intentions. They say, oh, everything was messed up, and I have all this energy, and I have all these ideas, and I'm going to fix things. And I think that's true of Emmanuel right now. I think he's working very hard. Daley in his first terms in office worked very hard. The first Mayor Daley in his first terms in office worked very hard. So I think there's actually a lot more in common than differences. I think you sort of have to see the whole movie to see the differences.
So I'm 53 years old.
Yeah.
I grew up in Chicago. I've never been anywhere else. So I brought up that Daley was the greatest, both father
The first Mayor Daley, right? Yeah.
And with the Harold Washington in between. But now that I'm studying, and I understand you work for the Huffington Post, I see you being more pro this agenda. But I see it tying this in with the Heartland and free market. I see Daley and Harold Washington and Rahm Emanuel, Daley Sr. and Jr., all growing government. And I have a small business in Chicago, so I see permits are a hassle, property taxes are getting, people are leaving the city, there's a huge amount of empty storefronts. I'm wondering if Daley's legacy is going to be kind of a slow death like Detroit. People are always talking about, are we going to become Detroit? Yeah. And I see Rahm Emanuel continuing this. So I'm just wondering if his legacy is more about growing government, giving out contracts, keeping in power, not doing anything about crime in schools. And I'm wondering if that's another book that could be written, that Daley maybe was not as great as people are saying.
Well, I actually try to be very balanced. I actually I think I'm very balanced about his accomplishment mistakes. I think everyone's legacy, actually including everyone in this room, is going to be a mixture of successes and failures. So the fact that someone has a mixture of success and failures to me is what you'd expect of anyone.
Overall, I think he grew government, he continued to support Michael Madigan, supported federal issues like federal Department of Education. He's grown. And taxes is the main thing.
So a couple things.
Deficits,
so a couple things. I do. The first mistake I showed that graph. Well, so for the first 11 years in office, he balanced the budget. So between 1989 and 2000, he was a very disciplined mayor for those 11 years. Very disciplined, and kept taxes in check and kept a lot.
He raised property taxes significantly.
No, but it's relative. It's relative to if you're going to live in Chicago or if you're going to live in New York or if you're going to live in a big city, every mayor you're ever going to get for your whole life is going to be like that. So you can't like compare him to like some ideal person. The ideal person doesn't exist. So relative to big city Democratic mayors, between 1989 and 2000, he was very disciplined. Then, if you flip the story between 2001 and when he retired in 2011, he had these really significant operating deficits. I would agree with you that those are not defendable. I mean, some of Daley's supporters defend them for various reasons. I don't think they're defendable. I think he should have been much more disciplined about getting better contracts with the unions, keeping budgets down, keeping taxes down. So I actually think his first 11 years he did a good job with that, and I think his next 11 years he didn't do a good job with that. But you have to compare. It's only fair. He's a big city mayor in a Democratic city, so you can't compare him to an ideal. You have to compare him to who else would be in the job.
Just follow up. Maybe all the mayors are bad. Well, specifically the pensions.
Yeah.
can he be blamed for the pension mess right now? And I think
for the Chicago portion of it, not the state of Illinois, but for the Chicago.
I blame him for all of it, for supporting any of it, because.
Well, he's not responsible for the state of Illinois. Madigan is much more. Yeah, Madigan is much more responsible for the state. But I would say we didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about it today. But in the book, if you read the book, in 1991, Daley was running for re-election. And in the Illinois legislature, there was a bill proposed, which Daley quietly but strongly supported. And in that bill, it reformed pensions for employees like aldermen and mayor and so forth. Historically, aldermen and mayor had gotten very small pensions in Chicago. In 1991, when this law was passed, it made them actually quite large. So if you were alderman for 20 years under this new law, you actually got quite a large pension. Daley was running for re-election in 91, and he supported that in Springfield. And if you look at the pension problems we have today, if you fast forward the movie from 1991 today, so almost 20 years later, that bill, which he supported, is a big part of the problem. So you asked a question. Let someone who hasn't asked a question.
Did all this research give you any thoughts about term limits for mayor?
So yeah, it's heresy in Chicago, but I'm unequivocally in support of term limits for everyone. I think everyone should be term limited. I think principals of high schools should be term limited. I think CEOs of public companies should be term limited. I think mayors of Chicago should be term limited. So it's nothing personal. It's not just mayors of Chicago. For me, it comes back to your view of human nature. So if you're fundamentally an optimistic person who thinks humans most of the time do the right thing, then you should be against term limits. If you're a little bit more cynical and you think humans are sort of corruptible, sort of flawed, their nature, then I think you should be for term limits, and I'm for term limits.
To address Mark's concern, I've often thought about that question too, whether or not Chicago would end up being like Detroit. Mm-hmm. And I've told people that, but a friend of mine has corrected me and said that Chicago is not going to be Detroit for a couple of simple reasons. One, the mayor in Detroit, Coleman Young, was very hostile towards business. So the mayors in Chicago have not had that attitude. Harold Washington was not anti-business. Right. So you've had none of that. And then the other thing, and I hope I don't offend anyone, but he said, he's a fellow African-American, he says, there's too many white people here who are in control. That's not going to happen. Detroit was a completely different situation, so I don't think you had that. So
I'm not an expert on Detroit, so I can't talk about it, but I know a little bit about Chicago. Chicago, the greater Chicago area has a $460 billion economy. $460 billion economy. It's huge. It's actually, if it was a country, I think would be the 25th largest country in the world in terms of GDP. Chicago, greater Chicago area has a really vibrant, strong economy. And so that's, $460 billion in GDP is not going down the drain.
I've got a couple of things
that
I'd like to share. First of all, Keith, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I think this is a fantastic presentation. I like the idea of a biography that doesn't have an axe to grind, that doesn't try to spin everything as showing that he's a bad guy or showing that he's a good guy. I think this should be the first volume of a series that you write, and maybe the next one or two or three could cover some ground that you didn't cover. The race thing is hugely important, and I think Kevin is on to something there, and I'd like to make a couple of comments
sure.
and roll back to the race thing and
okay.
kind of put it in your lap. Had the position of mayor of Chicago not become a bipartisan or a nonpartisan race, I think white Democrats knew there would never be a white Democrat governor or mayor again, that it would be black Democrats and white Republicans, because
mm-hmm.
Republicans would always split the white vote, and the Democrats would end up dominating, blacks would dominate the Democratic Party.
So can I tell you a quick joke? So, sorry to interrupt. So this is a joke, but so what do you call a Daley Democrat?
Daley Democrat.
A Republican. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. So I think it was a very cynical thing that was specifically designed to prevent Chicago from ever getting a black mayor. And this meme that's out there, Chicago could become another Detroit. When I got here in 1976, within 3 months, I heard that if we ever get a black mayor, we're going to be just like Detroit. And that rallied the whole white, all during the 1980s. That That was the theme that was in this town, was that we don't want to become another Detroit. So race is on everybody's minds. Corruption in the city, you have a 12-page chapter in this 350-page book that talks about corruption.
But it's in other chapters as well, but yeah.
Okay, I'm glad that it's scattered around in other chapters. It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
It just permeates the city. You use the phrase the corruption tax,
right.
And I've been told by more than one person, it's 10, 20, 30% of the cost of living in this town is just outright corruption.
So the University of Illinois at Chicago has done a bunch of studies, but in one of their studies they looked at corruption, and this gets a little bit to your point, in Chicago and the state of Illinois, and their theory is, well, the state of Illinois is just sort of like an extension of Chicago. And anyway, the number they come up with is like $500 billion in terms of like a tax. You know, just like if everything was run perfectly efficient, which of course it can't be, it would save $500 billion. So I don't know if that's true or not, but if in terms of order of magnitude, if that's even, let's say if it's even half of that, well, half of that would be, you know, $250 billion. It is a very large number.
So it's a tremendous black mark on this guy's term. Everything that he's accomplished, you can, I think, look at and say, it's almost a myth.
Well, I'm not quite that harsh. So a couple things. One is, I tried to identify when corruption started in Chicago, and the first political corruption scandal in Chicago was 18 months after the city was founded. So, no, seriously. So I forgot the dates, but like the city was founded in like 1836. In 1838, there was this gigantic corruption scandal. So corruption goes way back. And in terms of my view of human nature, I think you do need a big city. There's no big city. By the way, I've lived in New York, I've lived in Tokyo, I've lived in Chicago, I've spent a lot of time in Paris, I've spent a lot of time in Hong Kong. There's no big city in the world that doesn't have a lot of corruption. So corruption and big city sort of go together. And I'm not defending it, I'm just making the observation. In big cities have corruption. So I think there's a certain amount of, you got to grease the wheels to a certain extent. So for example, if you were trying to fix the public schools and there was some, business person who was totally against it, well, what do you think of giving that business person a contract so then they support school reform? Well, I think that's a real issue. I think if you're mayor of Chicago, that is a real issue. That's not like a hypothetical. And so you can say, well, we won't do school reform, and I'll be, holier than thou, or I give this businessman a contract, he shuts his mouth and supports school reform. I think that is a real issue if you're mayor of Chicago. And so my view is, if corruption is sort of, knee high, I'm fine with it, and if it's waist high, I'm not fine with it. No, seriously, I'm just not a purist about human nature. So then the question is, are we knee high or are we waist high? And then that becomes, a much more difficult question. So I don't know if that sounds too cynical to you, but
sound very much like a Chicago way guy. It's remarkable that a really intelligent, well-trained, scholarly guy like you would.
Well, it gets back to your view of human nature. It is human nature.
Milwaukee doesn't have this kind of corruption. I know it's not a world-class city. Indianapolis doesn't have this culture of corruption.
But New York does, and Tokyo does, and Hong Kong does, and big cities do.
You said that the mayor balanced budgets for the first 13 years?
First 11.
First 11,
yeah.
Okay. We know actually he didn't, that he was doing that by stealing money out of the pensions.
Right.
And using it to do daily or operating expenses. And that just got worse and worse over the years. So one of his really worst legacies, which you acknowledged, is the underfunded public pension
right.
crisis that's going to be causing us going forward. On education, you can sympathize a lot with teachers having to educate kids who come into class barefoot and in really bad shape. It's a legacy of how Mayor Daley and his father, I think, solved the race problem in the city. They solved it through segregation. You look at this room, there's, this is not an ethnically diverse crowd here. The city itself is one of the most segregated in the entire country.
Right.
The schools are the most segregated schools in the entire country.
Yeah.
The crime rate in the white parts of this town are low. The crime rates in the black parts of the town are through the roof.
Right.
That's not an accident. I think in the 1980s, that was the solution to the race problems in the city of Chicago. I think Daley and the city council said, let's segregate. Let's just separate the races. and we'll just erect barriers, we'll pay people off, we'll keep the teachers happy because they're 80% black, and so the schools now are 80% black. We don't want good public schools in the city of Chicago. Mayor Daley told that to Lee Walker to his face. He said, we don't want good public schools. That'll keep black middle class people in town here. We would just as soon keep that ghettoized into a non-empowered community that doesn't matter. And no matter how bad the public schools in Chicago get, they'll never have any political implications because it's just poor black folk, and they don't vote. They don't count.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. A couple things. Your first comment, then your second comment. So your first comment about the budgets, I actually think you're being a little too tough on him. I think in the first 11 years when he balanced budgets, he did dip into the pensions a little bit. But I think he had every intention of balancing the budgets, like in those years. I think he, from his perspective, was cutting things and was keeping things down and was really making a good faith effort.
And I agree. He may not have understood.
Yeah, and some of his advisors who were very sophisticated people, I think in those early years might have said, oh, this is fine, don't worry about this. We'll just dip into this pension for a year or two. So I think he had made a good faith effort in those 11 years to balance budgets, and that in the second 11 years didn't make the good faith effort. So anyway, on that. In terms of the racial thing, I actually don't quite agree with you about the similarities between the first Mayor Daley and the second Mayor Daley. I think the first Mayor Daley most deliberately and systematically tried to keep the city racially segregated, certainly with schools, with public housing, and highways and other things where he controlled things. I think the first Mayor Daley, I think there's plenty of evidence that he systematically did that. And that, by the way, he was mayor for 21 years, so he was mayor for a long time. So that really created like an institutional framework of sort of racial segregation. And like, for example, he drove Martin Luther King out of the city and did a bunch of other things. I don't think that's the same story for the second Mayor Daley. I think that the second Mayor Daley really, and I think it's fair that you could, I think it's fair you could question on whether he was successful with schools or housing or stuff. But I think he actually really wanted to improve the schools and really wanted to improve the housing in a real good faith way that was different than his father. You could say, well, he failed, he didn't do it. But I think that's different. I think his intentions were actually very good. So I think it's a different story than his father.
I think it's Joe. I think, human nature is the same whether you live in Chicago or you live in Des Moines, Iowa, or you live in Ukraine. So the corruption, I think, has to be explained by something different. And I would suggest that what's different about city government is the level of governmentality versus market, just allowing individuals to make solutions to the problems that government steps into and says, no, you can't do that, we're going to do that. And I think Chicago is unique among cities. One of the things that Chicago is unique among cities is the level, is the scope and the nature of the responsibility of aldermen.
Yeah, that's true.
This opens up just a whole universe of corruption which does not exist even in other big cities.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And so I don't think I think human nature is a constant. And to the extent that you have governmentality controlling how people live their lives versus just allowing people to live their lives and pay the consequences themselves of their mistakes, that's where I think this extraordinary level of corruption is. I lived for a while in the Soviet Union for a year, and very similar in terms of corruption because of the level of governmentality. So I would think that you maybe want to rethink that.
No, so I agree with you largely, by the way. But first of all, I do think human nature is the most important part. But then giving human nature is what are the set of constraints that people might function in. In Chicago has 50 wards, so it has 50 aldermen. It's I forgot the exact number, but its number of citizens per alderman is the lowest of any big city in the country. And so that what it ends up doing and giving a political culture in Chicago is the aldermen here in Chicago have huge amounts of discretion in their wards where they can make decisions, like sort of big, important decisions, just sort of as a person. And that creates all sorts of bad incentives. So I agree with you, the system is part of it, but I also think I don't think Chicago is unique as a big city with corruption. I really think if you systematically studied big cities, you couldn't find a big city without a lot of corruption. I don't know of one. There's cute little cities with low levels of corruption, but there's not cute big cities with no corruption. And one of the theories about that is in little cities, that if you steal from the city, you actually feel like you're robbing your neighbor. Like, I know you. Like, I know you. Like, we're friends. And so if I take this money, I'm sort of taking it from you. In a big city, it's sort of like, you know, who's going to miss, you know, this money? So there's a less personal sense of taking things. That's one theory why you don't hear about these big scandals in cute little towns like the way you do in big towns.
Time for one more question? Anyone?
With respect to crime, you mentioned New York. Why was it never considered, well, I shouldn't say never, but why wasn't the, shall we say, the New York model somewhat adopted, or at least, you know, here in Chicago, because it worked under Giuliani. So there was some precedent, and I think it was in the book, The Tipping Point, where what they did was they stopped small crime, and that prevented, you know, larger crimes from happening. And I've talked to some City of Chicago policemen who said that, you know, they thought that would have been the model that would have worked here, you know, obviously with adjustments. Why was that never, or do you know why that wasn't done here?
A couple things. So New York actually is called broken window. So the theory was if you find someone committing a little crime like breaking a window, well then that if you stop them from doing that, it might turn out that that's a person who also commits bigger crimes like murder. So if you stop them from committing the little crime, you can stop them from committing the big crime. So that was a theory. And New York really backed that really wholeheartedly. They put all sorts of information systems and all sorts of things behind that. And they also had, someone mentioned, a mayor, Giuliani, who had a really big personality, and he wholeheartedly supported it. He had a really large personality, and so he was willing to do it. In Chicago, it hasn't been backed as much. One is you didn't have like sort of a Giuliani who was willing to risk it politically on that. And some of the tactics that New York used were called like things like stop and frisk, where a police officer, if they just saw some suspicious kids or something, just to stop them, frisk them, see if they have any guns or whatever, were controversial in New York. But Giuliani said, "Yeah, I don't care. You know, you can hate me. I don't care. We're doing stop and frisk." You know, which takes political courage to do that. In Chicago, we never had that person, not Daley or another person. Who would say?
But weren't we always doing it in Chicago? So we never went.
We did
coddling criminals the way that New York did. So
we did some of it, but it wasn't a Giuliani was just very open about it. He said, I'm the mayor, and this is the policy. So if you're a police officer, or if you're a police officer, like you need to do it. In Chicago, in some districts, and some police officers did that. But it wasn't the city policy, and so it's different whether something's a policy or not a policy.
He also stuck up for the cops and told the community organizers to take a walk when they would, you know, they made a living off of harassing and running down the cops in New York City. He told them, get out of my office.
Well, yeah, some of them would bring charges against police officers and so forth, and the mayor would defend them. He'd say, I'm the mayor, this is my policy, this person was doing their job or whatever. And if you're a police officer, you'd like to know that if I get in a little bit of hot water, that the mayor's going to stand up there in front of the cameras and defend me. Otherwise, you're worried. It might not be worth it. So I think having something being a policy, even if it's a controversial policy, is different than just one-off.
Let's.
Thank you.